Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today, we will be talking about the conservation of penguins. Joining us is Boersma, who is a conservation biologist and professor at the University of Washington. She is famously known for her work on Magellanic penguins. She is also the co-chair of the IUCN Penguin Specialist Group. I hope you enjoy this podcast episode and do not forget to share and subscribe. So welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on to talk about the great work you're doing with penguins. So what got you interested in studying penguins?
How could you not be interested in penguins? They're comical, they're funny, they're engaging, they stand upright, they act in a lot of ways like humans. They have characteristics that certainly remind people of people more than penguins. So they're just engaging. And so I've always found penguins extremely interesting. And I've spent now more than 50 years of my life studying them, and I still find them endlessly engaging.
How many species of penguins are there in the world, and where are they found?
That's a very interesting question because penguins are Southern Hemisphere birds. So they're only really found in the Southern Hemisphere, but the Galapagos Penguins crosses the equator. So it actually is in the Northern Hemisphere. The rest of the penguins that are found in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, are in zoos and aquariums, and we've moved them there. There used to be penguins in the wild in Norway. Now, how did they get to Norway? Well, there were whalers and sealers that went to the Antarctic to render whales for their oil and take seals for their meat and for their fur. And so they went down to the Antarctic, and when they came back to Norway, they brought penguins. And they released them in the fjords in Norway. And so there were penguins that lived in Norway for decades. Now there's none that are there because there are too many predators in the Northern Hemisphere, mink, things like that eat penguins, chicks, or eggs. And so now there are not really very many wild penguins in the Northern Hemisphere. A few years ago, there were some Humboldt penguins that were found in Alaska. They probably came up on a boat out of Peru and then got dropped off in Puget Sound. And there were a number of pictures that were taken. So penguins have gotten into the Northern Hemisphere, but always with the help of humans.
What are some of the general threats faced by penguins as a whole?
I think the real problem for penguins is the same problem for all wildlife. There's 8 billion people in the world, and all people want to consume. And we're consuming more and more, which means there's less and less left for wildlife. So that's the biggest problem, is really too many people, too much consumption. And so if we want to do something to help wildlife, our best bet is to reduce our consumption and reduce our numbers.
You are a scientific fellow at the Wildlife Conservation Society, leading a research project on the Magellanic penguins in Argentina. Could you talk a bit about this project?
Certainly. I've worked on penguins for 54 years, mostly on Galapagos penguins, and for the last 40 years on Magellanic penguins, because I have found them so fascinating. Because as you study these penguins, you learn more and more about them. And the real threats to penguins, of course, now, as I've said, are really consumption and people. We used to directly kill penguins. We killed particularly king penguins, which is the second largest species, and put them into digesters so that we could get their oil, so that we could burn oil and keep our candles lit and things like that. Now, of course, we don't render penguins, but these huge digesters took thousands of penguins and rendered them into oil. So harvest was a major problem for penguins. Still, the number of penguins in the world is continuing to decline, and some species are in real trouble because there's hardly any of them left. The best example really is African penguins, because there used to be millions of African penguins. Now there's probably less than 10,000 breeding pairs of African penguins. Why? Because we've taken so much of the fish out of the ocean. There's not any fish left for the penguins. And so that's been a real problem in South Africa. It's simply not enough food. And then another problem for penguins, of course, is climate change, because they don't do well if you change the productivity of an area or the currents or whatever. So that's a problem for many species of penguins. They get caught in fishing nets, and so they get directly killed that way. And we spill lots of things into the ocean, whether it be oil or whether it be mercury or gasoline or other sorts of products. And most of those, oil and penguins do not mix. So when penguins get a little bit of oil, that makes them cold and they have to eat more, or they eventually lose more and more energy and they'll die from starvation. So penguins face a lot of threats. Most of them are related to climate change or to people.
So you've worked on Galapagos penguins for 54 years. So talk about your research on this species.
I'm particularly interested in learning enough about penguins and their natural history to be able to say, how could we make a difference so that penguins can continue to exist with humans? And so, for example, the real problem that when I started working on Magellanic penguins in Argentina, there were thousands, literally thousands of penguins that were dead on the beach, covered in oil. Why were they covered in oil? Because tankers released some of their oil from their ballast water, and it went into the water, and penguins wouldn't see it and swim into it, and then they'd get oiled, and then they get cold. Just like if you're in a down coat and you stand out in a rainstorm, a down coat won't do you any good unless it's waterproof in a rainstorm. If you stand out in a down coat, it'll absorb water, and if you're in a down coat, you will eventually get really cold and you would die. And the same thing's true for penguins. If they get oiled, their down coat no longer keeps the heat in and keeps them warm. And so they get cold. And so they have two choices. One, they can eat more. Eating more is hard because they got to catch fish or crustaceans to eat. Or the other thing they can do is come ashore. And if they come ashore, there's no food on shore. And that's what happens. These penguins in Argentina came ashore because they got cold, and then there's no fish on shore. And so eventually they starve to death. So it's a slow death. Penguins can starve for a long period of time. That's what makes them so resilient. I mean, they can not eat for weeks and live on their fat reserves. And of course, they don't need water because they can drink seawater, and then they can excrete the salt out of their nose. Basically, they have salt glands, and the salt glands act kind of like a kidney, takes the salt out, and then they can excrete the salt, which you see it dripping off the bill of penguins or albatrosses or most all seabirds, because they all have salt glands. So they get rid of the salt that way, and they then have fresh water. And so they don't need fresh water. They can simply process their own by drinking seawater. And that's a real problem. I mean, in the sense that the penguins can exist as long as they've got enough food and as long as there's seawater. But when you take so much of the fish out of the ocean, that becomes a real problem, because how can they feed their young? And that's one of the problems that we've been seeing in Argentina. The major cause of death for penguins is that for little penguins are chicks. All the chicks, their major problem is that they end up starving to death because the parents are not coming back frequently enough and bringing them enough fish. So that's a real issue. So what can you do about that? Well, one thing is we cannot eat fish that are raised on fish meal. So a lot of the anchovy that are harvested are turned into fish meal. And then the fish meal is fed to salmon and other tilapia, a lot of different kind of fish that we can raise that way. And the fish meal also goes into other sort of products. So poor quality fish often becomes cat food, dog food, chicken feed, things like that. And what you really want is to have good quality fish that can be turned into anchovies for the top of your pizza, or sardines that are canned. Those are higher quality, and it would be much better if we used our fish resources in a high quality way to feed people and not feed other fish.
So you are also the co-chair of the IUCN Penguin Specialist Group. So could you talk a bit about what this specialist group does and what are the group's objectives?
Our objective is to help penguins around the world. So we want wild penguins in perpetuity. That's our slogan, wild penguins in perpetuity, which means that we don't want penguins just to be found in zoos. We want penguins to be found in the wild. And to be able to do that means that you have to have enough food for penguins. You got to have good places for them to breed and live. And you've got to keep them away from some of the hazards that people put into the ocean, like oil, pollution, things like that. So penguins in perpetuity, and it's a volunteer group. Nobody gets paid, but all of the people that are on the penguin specialist group are really interested in doing research, most of them, on penguins and trying to figure out ways to help penguins so that we can have penguins in the wild for perpetuity. So it's a volunteer position that people apply to become members of the penguin specialist group for IUCN. And we have about 60 members currently, and they help determine some of the problems facing penguins and what we can do to make life better in the wild for penguins. In some cases, governments have not surveyed any of the colonies or very many of their colonies for penguins. So we urge governments to keep track of what's happening to their penguins, particularly for their decline. So African penguins, for example, one of the things that the specialist group has done, along with many volunteers and people around the world, is to try to make marine protected areas so penguins have a place where they can find food and raise their young in South Africa. And these are very small reserves. They're like 30 kilometers, which is how far a penguin can look for food, African penguins, while they're raising chicks. 30 kilometers is not far. Magellanic penguins can swim over 170 kilometers in a day. So they would need much bigger reserves. And the problem is none of the fishing fleet wants to turn over much of the sea to for conservation or to help. Now we've got a 30 by 30 law that the UN has been pushing, which means 30% of our ocean should be protected by 2030. And that would help a lot, but you need to make sure that we have places for penguins and their food, as well as polar bears and walrus and things like that. And that's what the IUCN is really trying to do, is to highlight what species should be of concern. So they have a red list, and over half of the penguins are on the IUCN species red list, which means they're in trouble. Their populations are declining. And we have to figure out ways to help those penguins so that they don't continue to decline.
You also direct the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels. What exactly is this center about, and what are some current projects which are being worked upon by the center?
There's no other major university that I'm aware of that is really interested in sentinel species, and particularly long-term studies of sentinel species. The Center for Ecosystem Sentinels has a number of databases that are really long-term. One is Galapagos penguins that I've been working on for 54 years. Another one are these Magellanic penguins that the center has been working on now for more than 40 years in Argentina. And it's these long-term studies that can really help inform us about what is happening in the environment that we as people live in, and what we can do to help some of the wildlife maintain their populations and continue to flourish. So, for example, for Magellanic penguins, we've been studying them as I said, for 54 years. We know that there's two things that are really important for Galapagos penguins. One are the Galapagos Islands. And one of the things that happened to the Galapagos Islands, because originally there were no people that lived in the Galapagos Islands, was the introduction of cats and rats and dogs and other predators on penguins. And we still we haven't been able to remove the cats and the rats from still some of the islands, and then pigs were introduced. So particularly for penguins, they live mostly on desert islands where there are not predators. And so having introduced predators like cats and in particular and rats has been a real problem, because they eat eggs as well as small chicks. And of course, even cats can take adult Galapagos penguins. So one of the goals is to try to figure out what are some of the real problems in some of these areas. Like for African penguins, it's really no limits on fishing. We need more marine protected areas that excludes fishing in those areas that are close to the breeding colonies, so that African penguins can successfully raise their chicks. And if they have food, they'll raise their chicks. But if they don't have enough food, and if they have to compete with fishing boats that have huge nets and go through there and clean everything out, the penguins don't have much of a chance. So it's really trying to identify how can we help some of these species of penguins. For example, for Magellanic penguins, when I first went down there in 1982, you looked at the beaches, and some of the beaches were literally covered in dead penguins, covered with oil. And in fact, in some years, 80% of the beaches that we walked, 80% of the penguins we found dead on those beaches were covered with oil. That takes long-term studies to figure out what can we do. We argued and worked with others, with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and moved the tanker lanes further offshore in Argentina. And after 40 years, I went back with one of my students, Esteban Freres, who walked these beaches 40 years ago, and we walked the same beaches again. And it was really exciting in March of 2022, because we found no oil dead penguins. So moving the tanker lanes and publicizing the problem actually made a difference. There were changes in laws where the tanker lanes could be. There was changes in discharging oily ballast water into the environment. So that's not done nearly as much as it used to be. And of course, it's illegal to do that. But it doesn't matter sometimes if things are legal or not. Bad actors get in and do bad things. But at least in March 2022, we found no oiled penguins. And as I said, in 1982, 80% of the birds that we found dead along the beach were covered in oil. So we can make a big difference. And a lot of it is just changing human behavior and being more sensitive to other species in the environment that we want to be around for a long time.
So my final question for this interview is that what have been some of your greatest challenges and greatest learnings from your conservation career?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is to change human behavior. Fortunately, people love penguins, and so in some cases, they are willing to modify their behavior. A lot of it wouldn't take a big change, but some of it is still hard won. For example, we all want to have omega-3s, oils, and we'd like to live longer, and that comes from fish. So you can now buy, pills that have omega-3 oil in them, and they come from anchovies. And so they render the anchovies, you get the oil, and people take it as a supplement to their diet. The problem is that means all those anchovy are coming out to make supplements or to make fish meal, and that's not a good use, really, of anchovy. You'd rather have better use by humans, like eating the whole anchovy, putting it on your pizza or your sardines, canned sardines. That's a better use than fish meal, which takes a lot of energy to process it. And mostly the fish that come in, because they don't have to worry about the quality of the fish, they're partly rotted. And so that's not a good use of our limited resources. So a lot of it is going to be changing human behavior so that we make better use of our resources and allow other species to survive as well as humans.
That was the final question I had for this interview. Thank you so much for your time.